The Central Division is brutal, and I have to start it that way because it is. And the Minnesota Wild are up against it. The Minnesota Wild, of course, coming off of their first season outside the playoffs in a while. There are those fans in Minnesota that would say this is what was needed. This team wasn't really good enough, and they needed to see they weren't good enough. But we're going into our second general manager in 2 years. Fenton lasts a year, and now, of course, they're interviewing various candidates. I would think Hextall's probably the guy that ends up getting the job, but who knows? This is Minnesota. Fenton was really out of left field. And now everybody wants to go, Fenton wasn't ready. Fenton wasn't good. No, he wasn't. But then that says something to their hiring process last summer, which tells me I don't know how much more faith I'd have in them getting it right this year either. And that's when fans' confidence starts to wane in the organization, is when they make multiple mistakes. So they have to get the general managing hire done right this time. They had 83 points this past season. They had 101 the year before, 106 the year before that, 87 in 2015, 2016, and 2014, 2015. They had 100 points. So if you're a glass half full kind of person, they had 100 points plus in 3 of the previous 4 seasons. This year was just a setback, no big deal. Or if you're a glass half empty person, you can say, well, they were getting those 100-point seasons by hook and by crook, and now all of the horseshoes have stopped having their desired effect. The luck has wore off. And when you look at their goal scoring, 211 goals for, which was 28th in the NHL. The good news is they should be able to bounce back from that. And their goals against, they had 237. That's 13th. So their defense and goaltending, that was good enough to get to the playoffs. It was goal scoring that fell apart for them. And when you look at their record throughout the year, they weren't bad. They just weren't good enough. 7-3-2 in October. At the end of November, they were 14-9-2. December 18-17-3, and that's really the month that hurt them right there, because they were 4-8-1 that month, and that month really hurt their chances. January, they were 26-21-3 at the end of that month. 31-27-6 at the end of February. 36-34-9 at the end of March. And when the dust settled at the end of the season, they were 37-36-9. So they won more than they lost, but they didn't win enough. And again, you can point to a couple of rough months and say, well, if they turn those months around, they would have had 90-plus points and they would have been in the playoffs. So again, you can be an optimistic Wild fan, and that's certainly your prerogative if you want to be. For me, I look at this team and I say, well, they're probably going to finish outside the playoffs again, in part because the division they're in is just so stacked. Now, in trying to pick who I thought would be their MVP, I went with Zach Parise. And I went with Zach Parise because Dubnyk is an honorable mention. Suter's an honorable mention. So Stahl. But really, if Parise's healthy, and if he's happy and he's motivated, he can still score a bunch of points. He can still be that leader. If he's not, Minnesota might find themselves playing games that don't matter by Christmas. So if Parise gets hurt, that roster is seriously going to be set back by that. And if he has a poor season or if he's distracted, it's going to be a long year for them as well. As stated, they were out of the playoffs this past season. The 3 years prior to that, 2018, 2017, and 2016, they were out in the first round. 2015, they made it to the second round. In terms of players who've exited that were of any importance, not really much of anybody. The roster that finished the season is going to be very similar to the one that starts this season, in part because they fired their general manager. They're bringing somebody new in. So the new guy may very well look at this roster and say, all right, give me some TNT and blow things up. Or he may look at this roster and say, yeah, that's pretty good, and leave it as it is and go through the season and see how things turn out. Your goals, I went with Jason Zucker. I went with Zucker for the simple reason that you've got Zucker and Zuccarello on the right side. I love that. That's fantastic. Please leave that as it is. And may they both be nicknamed Zook, and may it confuse the heck out of all the announcers. But I went with Zucker because if he can get 30-plus goals this year, that gives Minnesota a decent chance at least improving their lot in that division. It's a tough division. Dark horse, I went with Ryan Donato. I've talked up Donato a lot. He had 4 goals. He had 16 points after the trade from Boston, which I thought was a good trade for Minnesota, but I understand that basically in general. There may have been people in the locker room that may not have been happy with the moves that were being made. And what about, I have Luke Cunnin. Cunnin's kind of a forgotten guy. There's some hype around Nico Sturm now. And so Cunnin's kind of been, I'm not going to say forgotten, but I think that he could have a breakthrough season, and they kind of need that because counting on Mikko Koivu to be healthy all season, that's a dicey proposition. And trade bait, I went with Victor Rask because one of the first jobs that whoever takes over as general manager is going to have, one of the first tasks he has is to find somebody to take the Victor Rask contract. So, if the Herr Peter Chiarelli, he can't trade with himself. And in terms of it being a bad contract, all kidding aside, it's going to be tough to find a team that's going to take that cap hit and not want something else in return. So they've put themselves in a rough position, and in essence, it's because they didn't want to keep Nino Niederreiter, and it's just, all right, well, we'll just take whatever. And that's what happens when you take an attitude of, we need to get rid of this guy, we'll just take whatever. So, lesson learned by the Minnesota Wild, I guess, and we'll see what happens. But when you look at this forward group, there's a lot of graybeards in here that they're counting on to stay healthy, and that can be tricky. On the top line, you'd have Parise, Stahl, and Zucker. Second line, Kevin Fiala, Mikko Koivu, and Matt Zuccarello. Now, I like Fiala. I don't know that he's a top six forward. Jordan Greenway is there. He may very well end up in that second line spot. Joel Eriksson-Ek and Ryan Donato. So Donato's on the third line. As long as Donato's getting his ice time and he's happy, pretty good player. In Boston, it felt like he I'm not going to say he pouted, but it felt like he wasn't himself when he wasn't getting those chances in that ice time with the Bruins. Fourth line, Ryan Hartman, who was added, of course, on July 1st. Victor Rask and Marcus Foligno. Foligno's just, trucking along doing his job. Hartman, kind of a low-key pickup for them. We'll see how things turn out. Kyle Rao, Luke Cunnin, and JT Brown. JT Brown will get his share of games. He'll be a call-up. Probably end up in the American League. He'll clear waivers. That won't be a problem, I wouldn't think. Nico Sturm, as stated, he will push for a spot on this roster. I don't know if it'll be down the middle. That's all going to depend on whether or not Koivu's able to stay healthy. And then there's Luke Johnson that got in some games this past season as well. It is an unspectacular lineup that they have up front. And there are a number of guys who you can expect to kind of drop in terms of their offense this year. And Koivu would be on that list at his age. Eric Stahl, Zach Parise, even Zuccarello. Zuccarello's not a young kid here. So this is an old roster, and it was talked about a lot last year, and they're trying to fix that. The blue line is fantastic. Can I just say the blue line's top four is great. Ryan Suter, Jared Spurgeon, Jonas Brodin, and Matt Dumba. That is one of the best top fours in the National Hockey League. That being said, the amount of offense generated from this blue line could make a big difference here. They cannot be 28th in offense, so they may be counting on their defense a little bit more. And, of course, any Minnesota Wild fan will tell you, as they've told me numerous times, we may have fallen out of the playoffs and fallen way off, but that all took place based on Dumba being injured. And once Dumba got injured, we just didn't have a defense. It wasn't the same. And I'm not going to argue that it was, because it wasn't. Nick Seeler, Greg Patterin, Brad Hunt, Matt Bartkowski, Louis Belpedio. These guys are all right-handed defensemen. Now, when I do the charts, I make sure that the top six is basically the top six. I don't worry as much about who's actually left and who's a right defenseman. When we get outside of that, I try to make sure that it's right defenseman and left. Now, what's interesting is Fedor Gordeev, okay, who got picked up in a trade. I know that he's still a young defenseman, but at 6'7", if he's able to come over, if he's able to play, and I'm pretty sure I saw him listed, double check. Yep, Gordiev's signed. So with him under an entry-level contract, at 6'7", it's tough not to give him a shot at a roster spot, isn't it? It'd be tough not to give him a few games and just see, because if his mobility is good and he's 6'7", that's a pretty attractive defenseman right there. And it would give them a different look. No offense to Seeler, of course, if he was the one that got bumped out. But there's some good depth here. Brad Hunt, of course, re-upped with them in the offseason. And I'm not going to say that if Dumba or Suter got hurt that wouldn't just kill it, because it kind of sort of does. But most teams in the league, if you take out one of their top 4 defensemen, it's going to seriously hurt their blue line. So this is where I can get behind Minnesota fans and say, yeah, I can understand why you feel like losing Dumba killed your season. Goaltending, Devin Dubnyk, Alex Stalock, quietly one of the better tandems in the NHL. And then there's a fight between Matt Robson and Kaapo Kakkonen, for that number 3 spot. And Robson's a year older. He had some pretty good NCAA stats. If something happens and one of their goalies gets hurt, it'll be interesting to see who they call up for the backup spot, because they do have those 2 kids. And at 23 years of age, Robson may very well get a shot at a couple of games if something happened to either Dubnyk or Stalock. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with that, because Kakkonen I've been keeping an eye on a little bit, because that's a great name. So, bring him up. And anyways, this roster has its share of intrigue, but I can't see them in this division finishing much higher than 7th. That being said, I could see things going really well. I could see them ending up 5th in the division. I do think you end up with 5 teams in the Central making the playoffs and 3 in the Pacific. I think both wild cards would go to the Central. So if they get 5th, I'm thinking playoffs, but I think it's more likely that they're going to end up at the bottom for this coming season, and then they're going to have to look at some tough choices going forward from there. I understand that they want to keep the veterans happy, and that there's a belief that this team can get back into the playoffs and get into the mix and be relevant again. And again, with this too, this doesn't factor in what a new general manager might do. We might be looking 2 months down the road and say, wow, Hextall came in and made this move, and this team looks great. But the odds of that are to me kind of slim, but we'll see. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below regarding the Minnesota Wild and their misfortunes this past season. Is this just a down year, or is this an indication of what's to come? That's the big question. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for all your support and for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.